This episode is brought to you by Accenture. When your advertising operations fall out of sync, everything else follows. Spotify and Accenture are working together to reinvent the rhythm of ad sales, using automation, analytics, and smarter workflows to simplify campaign delivery and access better data across the business. The result? Less time spent on operations, more time connecting brands with the moments and fandoms that matter most. Learn more at accenture.com/Spotify.
Running a small business means I wear lots of hats. When I put on my hiring hat, I can count on LinkedIn Hiring Pro to make it easy. LinkedIn Hiring Pro helps manage my hiring workflow, puts my job post in front of a unique network of professionals, and matches me with the best candidates for my business. I can also share my job with my network. No other job site lets me do that. No wonder most small businesses say they'd use LinkedIn Hiring Pro again. Hire right the first time. Post your job for free on LinkedIn today at linkedin.com/quality.
For a long time, people compared me to two separate celebrities, one being Alison Sweeney and the other being Christina Applegate. And that one even earned me the nickname at times of Kelly Bundy. This spring, I read the memoir of the woman who was Kelly Bundy and found out we had a lot more in common than the eyes.
You're listening to Unbound Off Script. Today, Beth Curry is stepping away from the noise to talk about the things that carry weight. Whether it's a personal reflection or a response to the heavy things you've shared with her, this is a space for the raw and the real.
Hey everybody, welcome back to Unbound Off Script. I'm Beth. Today I want to talk about Christina Applegate's memoir, You with the Sad Eyes. About growing up beside someone I've never met, about trauma and illness and the science that kind of connects them, because, I can't get through an episode with dragging psychology into the room. And for the first time, I'm actually going to read out loud a poem I wrote for my first son, and then kind of take it apart line by line the way that some of you have asked me to do since I first shared the print version of it. A quick note before we get going here. This episode touches on childhood sexual abuse, domestic violence, eating disorders, suicidal thoughts, pregnancy loss, and chronic illness. Nothing gratuitous. You know how I do this, but real. So if today isn't the day for that, I love you. Save this one for later. Okay. So there is, I think, a very specific kind of a relationship that you can have with a famous person. And nobody talks about it because it sounds utterly insane when you say it out loud. But I grew up with a stranger, and I want to talk about that. It wasn't so much that I was a fan exactly. It was more like I was assigned to someone, right? Like the world looks at you and looks at them and then kind of files you in the same drawer, as I alluded to in the cold open. And after enough years, you kind of start to feel like you're carrying a little piece of their public life around with you, whether you asked to or not, right? So that was me and Christina Applegate. So picture the setup, somewhere around 87, 88, I don't know, basement in Burlington, Ontario, where I grew up, a wood-paneled television the size of a small refrigerator. My dad on the couch, me on the floor, because apparently children in that era were not entitled to furniture. I don't know. The Married with Children theme kicks in. You know it. Frank Sinatra, Love and Marriage. And whenever Christina would turn up, my dad would wink at me or glance at me or nudge me with his elbow or whatever and just say, "There you are, Kelly." It was kind of like I had been contractually appearing on Fox sitcoms every week without my own knowledge, like I was moonlighting. But he never stopped, for years. Married with Children was kind of a ritual in my house for Dad and I. We watched it religiously, and I use that word deliberately because I grew up in the house where actual religion took up most of the oxygen, and the show was the closest thing we had to a shared sacrament that didn't involve a pew. Sunday mornings belonged to God, but the Bundys belonged to us, I guess. Mom hated it. It was pretty edgy and disrespectful for that time. I don't really recall where Jen was for any of it. But I loved that time, being able to spend time with my dad. We weren't watching Cops. We were watching this, it was one or the other. But I love the time. And I want to say that clearly because so much of what I write and talk about from my childhood is kind of heavy. And this wasn't, this was my dad laughing so hard at Al Bundy that he basically wheeze. He would make comparisons all the way up until he died between him and Al. The show was relatable to him then, And the man was as well. And to this day, when I see or hear Ed O'Neill, it's almost like my dad's still here in a way. Anyway, this was me getting to stay up and watch a show that was, by our household standards, kind of borderline criminal. Well, maybe by my mom's standards. I don't know. A show about a family that said the rude thing out loud, right? Do you understand what that was like for a kid raised on some things are better left alone? Pretty wild. So watching a family whose entire brand was saying the unspeakable thing at full volume, it was like practically exposure therapy. I don't know. Anyway, in the middle of it all was Kelly, of course, blonde and beautiful and dumb as a post by design and completely unbothered. Completely. Kelly did not read the room. Kelly Bundy did not manage anyone's emotions. She said whatever floated through her head and faced zero consequences. Obviously a written character, but, I studied her like she was like a nature documentary about a species that I'd never be allowed to join or something, right? Because I was the opposite. I was the kid who'd learned by kindergarten that my voice was dangerous, right? I was the kid who got the tight smile in Sunday school for asking why God drowned all the animals, I was the kid whose skin, and we'll get to this again if you haven't listened to season 3, because it matters more than I knew, erupted into angry red patches that made other kids kind of treat me like a walking disease. I mean, some kids said I had AIDS, and that rumor spread pretty quickly. So when people started telling me that I reminded them of her or I looked like her, like even though I was a fat kid, I don't think I looked so much like her when I was younger as much as I did as I got a little bit older, when it was past the time I was being compared to, if that makes sense. Anyway, when my own dad called me Kelly, there was something in any of that I couldn't have articulated at 13 years old or however old I was at the time. It felt like being mistaken for someone free, I guess. And the comparison kind of followed me through every era. The awkward era when I was watching it, the bleached hair era, which was just like 12, 13, 14 years ago. But I also did it way back when I was in high school. I also shaved my head then, but that was, I beat Bieber and Britney and all of them to that. But the young Kelly Bundy comments from friends and family and sometimes strangers, people had no idea that the girl they were comparing to television's most carefree teenager was at that exact moment in her life being kind of systematically taken apart by a predator, or starving inside a marriage of silence with her own family, or maybe later building this fortress of weight specifically so that nobody would ever look at me like that again. Like, that's the joke of it, right? Like, people kept comparing me to the character. And it took until this year, until I read this book, and I just finished it recently, for me to find out I'd had far more in common with the actress than just the eyes. So I want to talk about what this book actually is for those of you who haven't read it yet. And then I want to spend, I guess, the rest of the episode explaining why you should read it or get the audiobook, whatever, because she reads it. And I think that it comes across better hearing it from her. You with the Sad Eyes came out in March 2026. Instant #1 New York Times bestseller. Obviously, the title, if you didn't catch it, is the opening line of Cyndi Lauper's True Colors. You with the Sad Eyes, don't be discouraged. Which, when you know what's in the book, is devastating. Okay. I had no idea what to expect with this book. I didn't read reviews or anything like that. I just, felt compelled to read it in the way that I kind of felt compelled to read Matthew Perry's as well. But the whole memoir is essentially Christina turning around after 50 years and finally answering the question everyone's eyes had been asking her since she was a kid. What happened to you? So here's the basic shape of it. She grew up in Laurel Canyon in the 70s and the 80s, right? Which sounds glamorous, especially if you're like me and you're in LA a lot and you know what life is like in all the different parts of LA and surrounding areas. So yeah, it sounds glamorous until you read a single page of what it was actually like for her. Her father left when she was young. Her mom, a working actress and singer, fought addiction and ended up with a violent, drug-addicted man who beat them both. Christina started working as a child, being a baby in a commercial, then set stages. She was on Days of Our Lives as an infant, playing a little boy. Lots of different parts, right? Partly because the family needed the money and partly because she writes, because performing became an escape hatch from the home, right? Imagine that, right? The place with the lights and the cameras and the strangers telling you what to do was the safe place. One of the worst parts of the book that immediately made me cry. I didn't think I would cry. I didn't know. She was sexually assaulted at 5 years old by a female caregiver. She writes about it as a debt of witness that she owes to that little girl. And reviewers have noted it's the point of the book where her story, in her words, darkens almost to black. She was 5 years old. Hold on to that number because we're coming back to it when we talk about the science. But her bluntness when she, directly stated, just said it. Like there was no warning whatsoever. I think that's why it hit me so hard, because it was just like it was shocking and it's upsetting, it's devastating, whatever. Like it's just everything nauseating, and I don't know. It just made me sick. Anyway, enough of that. The fame came. Kelly Bundy at 15, 16 years old, that kind of, I don't know, the whole world falling in love with the ditzy blonde and the tight clothes, and behind the scenes, a teenage girl developing an eating disorder in order to fit into these clothes. She's brutally specific about this too. She had a vision of how Kelly should look, and to become that vision, she leaned deeper into anorexia, punishing herself for eating and going full days without food and wanting her bones visible. While America laughed at the character, and let's be honest, they ogled her as well. Then the grunge years, the Viper Room, the losses of that scene, a boyfriend so violent she genuinely feared he would kill her, a pregnancy she ended in 1991, about which she shares a poem she wrote at that time that will take you apart. A marriage that she knew was wrong while she was literally walking down the aisle. Breast cancer diagnosis at 36, double mastectomy, the later removal of her ovaries and fallopian tubes. And then in 2021, while filming the final season of Dead to Me, loved that show, by the way, like totally my kind of show. Watch it. She was diagnosed with MS. She has been open about what multiple sclerosis has done to her life. Constant pain that she rates around an 8 out of 10, her world contracting to the size of her bed. She jokes darkly about her life shrinking to the dimensions of her California king. Diapers, scooting down staircases on her butt. The end, essentially, of the acting career, she knew it. The end of dancing, which, if you know anything about her, the Broadway run, the Emmys performance of Dance Apocalyptic, all of it, was the end of something sacred. The detail that broke me a little as a person who wrote her own memoir out of decades of journals, Christina kept journals her whole life, starting at 13. She kept them in a fire retardant box, and her standing instruction to her assistant was, when I die, burn these, don't show anyone. But this book is built out of those journals. The ones that were supposed to die with her. She talked into a recorder for something like 100 hours and went back through decades of her own handwriting and turned the thing she wanted incinerated into a bestseller. She said writing it wasn't cathartic. She pushes back on the word, actually, and I respect it, because cathartic implies the pain drains out. And I can assure you from experience, it does not. But she did it anyway. Her stated reason, and this is the quote I promised you, is this: I truly believe that books can make people feel less alone. That's it. That's the whole mission statement. It's not redemption. It's not a comeback narrative, and then I healed and now I do yoga at sunrise. Just maybe if I say the unsayable thing, somebody out there stops feeling like the only one. Somebody out there was me, Christina. Hi. But I felt it and did it too before her book. It's just my reach isn't as big or important as Christina's. But anyway, here's where it gets weird for me, okay? And I mean weird in the way that trauma survivors will recognize instantly, and everyone else will just probably politely nod along to. Some of you know that season 3 of this podcast was me reading my memoir, The Other Side of Quiet. I read it out loud, chapter by chapter, my whole life, recorded, shared with whoever is listening, in my own voice. And I need you to understand what it was like to do that. And then, with that experience still fresh in my body, to pick up Christina's book and watch her describe doing the exact same excavation. I thought a lot about the ways that this woman and I are apparently running parallel lives on different budgets. So the first thing that I noticed was the disbelief. Christina's talked about how the people around her, even the people close to her, didn't know most of what's in this book, and that the stories were so far outside what anyone believed about her life that she'd essentially been living as a stranger among friends. And when I read that, I laughed out loud. Like, I literally laughed like a friggin' lunatic because that was the single most common reaction for my book. People who had known me for decades, reading about Brandon, about what happened on New Year's Eve in 1993, about Keir, about the Percocet search in 2012, and saying some version of, I never would have believed this. Not, I don't believe you. They believed me. They just could not reconcile the woman that they knew with the story she'd been carrying. And that gap, between who people see and what you've survived is one of the loneliest places on earth, to be honest. Christina lived in that gap with 8 million people watching her every week. I lived in it with a church congregation and a Facebook friends list, whatever. Different scale, identical architecture. Second thing was the Predator playbook. So Christina writes about an adult violence in her childhood and a boyfriend in adulthood she thought might kill her. I wrote about Brandon. He was an older boy who found me at 13, freshly out of braces, freshly out of years being treated like a contagion, and did exactly what predators do. He made me feel chosen. He made me feel interesting and seen, and he asked about my day and remembered the answers. And then one grain of sand at a time, he isolated me and controlled me and hit me and escalated until by 18, I was living inside a nightmare I was still calling a relationship. In my book, I laid out the playbook, the scouting for vulnerability, the manufactured specialness, the it'll be her secret, the intermittent kindness that kind of keeps you addicted to a person who is destroying you, right? And reading Christina's account of the violence in her life, I saw the same machinery, different men, same manual. The manual is why I get so worked up about this stuff, because predators are not improvising. They're running a program, okay? A program that works on almost anyone under the right conditions. And the more of us who publish the source code, the harder it gets to run. So, I speak. Another one is the body is a battlefield of sorts, right? So a parallel that's actually kind of an inversion, I think. And I find it fascinating in the bleakest possible way. So Christina's trauma and her industry drove her towards starvation, anorexia, bones out, punishment for eating a body whittled down to meet a vision, right? Mine drove me in the opposite direction, especially after Keir, after the years that I call the self-torture years. I built armor out of food. By 2012, my scale, which stopped at 350, had given up on me. I was somewhere near 400 pounds. I was avoiding mirrors and photos, and I was avoiding existing in like 3 dimensions. 2 women, 2 eating disorders aimed in opposite directions, powered by the same fuel. A nervous system that had decided the body itself was the problem. She made hers disappear by shrinking it. I made mine disappear by hiding it inside a bigger one. Neither of us was really doing anything about food. We were doing something about safety, right? And I say this because I've done the reading and I've lived the syllabus. Like, eating disorders are among the most common long-range consequences of childhood and adolescent trauma. I talk about it a lot. And they're wildly underdiagnosed in people whose disorder makes them larger rather than smaller. Nobody staged an intervention for me. People stage interventions for the girl who's disappearing, right? The girl who's expanding just gets diet tips. Another parallel is the almost ending. So Christina writes about depression in dark places with a bluntness that reviewers keep calling dangerous, which tells you a lot about how sanitized we expect these books to be, right? I wrote about May 2012, the day I Googled how many Percocet it would take with my beautiful kid, in my life. And I wrote about how it wasn't really about wanting to die. It was kind of about wanting the pain to stop, which anyone who's kind of stood at that specific window will tell you are different things that look identical from the outside. I closed the laptop and I called my husband and I said, the 6 words that probably saved my life. I need help. I'm killing myself. Whatever, I need help. I asked for help. Christina, in her own way, spent decades at various windows. We both stepped back. Not everyone does. That's part of why both of these books exist, though. Then there's the journal. She kept hers in a fire retardant box with burn after death instructions, and I kept mine in my head and my body because, as I wrote in my own disclaimer, trauma doesn't come with transcripts. But we both did the same thing in the end. We went back into the archive we'd spent our lives protecting, and we published it. She talked 100 hours into a recorder. I read mine aloud into a microphone for an entire season. Both of us essentially performed our own autopsies while still alive. I do not recommend it, and I completely recommend it. Both statements are absolutely true. Now, another kind of small, stupid parallel that somehow gets me the most, the narration. I guess she narrates her own audiobook, and apparently you can hear it. The places where her voice carries the weight. People said the same thing about season 3. For me, there were chapters I had to record in pieces. Chapter 8 took me weeks and a literal emotional support person to be present with me. There is something about saying it in your own voice that writing alone doesn't really touch, right? And I think I know what it is, and it's coming up in the psychology section, so hold that thought. Oh, and one more. This is like an absurd one. She reveals in the press for this book that she doesn't even like being called Christina Applegate, that the name gives her spine tingles, bad ones, because it belongs to the job and to the thing and not to the woman. Her real name, the one she uses at home, is Kiki. Kiki, she says, is fierce and free and doesn't have MS or trauma. So just take inventory here. Christina Applegate doesn't want to be called Christina Applegate, and I spent my childhood affectionately being called Kelly, a person neither of us actually is. At this point, the only person who's been correctly named in this entire saga is my dad. And honestly, jury's out. Al Bundy. So the stranger I never met. So this is the thing about the soul connection feeling, and I want to name it honestly because I know how it sounds. I know. I have never met Christina Applegate. She does not know I exist. This is, by every technical definition, a parasocial relationship. And I did not skip the psychology classes where we learned to be suspicious of those, okay? But there is a specific version of this that trauma survivors describe over and over. And it's not celebrity worship at all. It's recognition. Right? It's the thing that happened in my chest in chapter 1 of my own book when the world started kind of silencing people. And my body said, I've been here before. Survivors recognize each other through walls and through screens and through decades, through completely different lives, right? There's like a shared dialect, I guess, right? The dark jokes in the middle of the horror, the hypervigilance pretending to be intuition, the way that we narrate our worst moments in the flattest possible voice, because flat is how you survive telling it the first 100 times, right? So when I read her book, I wasn't reading a celebrity memoir. I was reading a letter from someone who grew up in the same way that I did, and in the same country I did. And I'm not talking Canada. I mean, the country of keep it quiet population, more of us than you would ever believe. So, there's that. And I just wanted to get that out of the way. Again, so salt and blue. This is another parallel that I held back because I don't know. I just feel like it needed its own little segment here. So somewhere in the middle of her book, Christina shares a poem. She wrote it in 1991 as a young actress to a baby she would never raise. A pregnancy she ended, a decision she carried in silence for a long time. And she didn't just mention that it happened. She put the actual poem on the page, the private thing written in the private voice for an audience of one who would never read it, published finally for millions, right? And I know exactly what that feels like because I did the same thing. Some of you saw me share a poem at the end of last year. It was actually on New Year's Eve. It was there. I just put it down without any context whatsoever. I shared it on social media. I didn't explain it, and I moved on. And ever since, people have asked, what does it mean? What's the feather? Why blue? And I've been dodging these questions, honestly, because explaining a poem feels a little like doing an autopsy on a bird. You learn how it worked, and it never flies the same way again. I didn't even want to explain it like the first couple of months after, because season 3 didn't release until early March, and I shared this on New Year's Eve. So, it was kind of a bit of a gap there where I took a risk. I didn't even want to talk about it. Some people figured it out, but even those people that did figure out what it was about didn't really understand, the meaning. So, this is the episode about mining the past for meaning. Okay. So I'm going to read it in full. And then for the first time, I want to take it apart stanza by stanza, just to kind of explain it to those of you who have had questions about it, because I'm finally ready to talk about it. So it's called Salt and Blue, and it's for Kier. The world was shouting midnight, and the bells began to ring. But I was in the hollowed dark with a boy who didn't sing. He never once unsealed his eyes to see the winter sky. He kept his vision to himself and let the world go by. I was a storm that broke the house. I scorched the very ground. I struck at him who stayed with me until the lost was found. Now many decades have taken flight like birds against the gray. He is the feather in the wind that never blew away. There is a touch of distant blue that finds me in the night, a secret held, both heavy and sweet, no longer locked from sight. I've carried a story, sacred and deep, through every New Year's night, a story that waits for the winter to break before it steps into the light. So I'm going to start with the title because I chose those two words very deliberately, okay? Like salt is tears, obviously. But salt is also what we've used for all of human history to preserve things, right? To keep them from decaying. Like that's what grief does, right? If you let it, it preserves the love in perfect condition forever at full strength. People think grief fades, and you know what? It doesn't really fade, in my opinion. It gets salted and blue. You'll see what the blue is by the end. The form now for my fellow nerds, those are ballad stanzas. Like I grew up in a pew, right? It looks like a hymn meter. Okay. So twice a week minimum. When I finally sat down to write about this most sacred loss of my life, my hands reached for the shape of like a song like that we would sing in church, right? It's also, if you listen to it, kind of the shape of a lullaby, which I guess is the cruelest thing about it, but also the truest. You know, this is the lullaby I never got to sing him, 32 years later. Anyway, so stanza 1, I'm going to explain it here. The world was shouting midnight and the bells began to ring. He came on New Year's Eve. While I was in that hospital room, the entire planet was counting down and cheering and kissing and celebrating a beginning, right? The loudest night of the human year. But I was in the hollow dark with a boy who didn't sing. He was stillborn. January 1st, 3:17 in the morning, I never heard his cry. In a book that is entirely about voice, about who gets one, who's denied one, what it costs to find one. My first son is the person I love who never got a single sound. He didn't sing. So I do. That's the arrangement now. The hollow dark. I want to defend that word because people expect horror words there. The room was the worst place I have ever been, that room for sure. And it was also holy, it was both. We held him for quite some time. Some of you know how long specifically, from season 3 or the book, if you hold a hard copy of it. The dark was hollowed. I won't take that back. Stanza 2, he never once unsealed his eyes. I never saw his eyes open. That's the plain fact under the lines, But look at what my poem does with it. He kept his vision to himself and let the world go by. I didn't write he was denied the sky. I gave him the agency. In the poem, he isn't a boy who was robbed of seeing. He's a boy who just keeps his vision private, who took one look at the reservation and politely declined. I don't know. That reframe took me decades. It might not even make sense to you as I try to explain it here. It's very hard to explain. Early grief writes the victim version, right? But old grief, mind grief, mind, M-I-N-E-D, it can afford him a little dignity, even a little mischief. He kept it to himself. Fair enough, baby. So did I for a long time. Stanza 3 is the confession. So I did a lot of confessing in season 3. I never once acted like I was the only victim in the book. I was, for many, many years, not a good person. And, I've owned that and I've given apologies to everyone I possibly could, sincere apologies. I'm repairing friendships, old friendships, relationships. I'm doing a lot of repair with putting my ego aside and making those admissions. And that was big for me. But also this confession here. I was a storm that broke the house. I scorched the very ground. I struck at him who stayed with me. That's the self-torture years, and that's Nate, the one person who wanted to love me through the worst of it. Kier's father, Nate. And I made him pay for it. I would throw the flowers in the trash. The cruelty aimed with a sniper's precision at the vulnerabilities only intimacy teaches you, right? If you've read chapter 10 or listened to episode, I guess it would be 10 or 11, whatever, of the podcast, you know that I don't flinch from this, and this poem doesn't either. I am the storm in my own elegy. Most poems about loss cast the writer as the rain-soaked mourner, right? But in mine, I'm the damn weather event. Because that's what unprocessed grief does. It doesn't stay sadness, it converts to violence, and it discharges at whoever's standing closest with their arms open. Until the lost was found, and I'll let that line stay double. The lost baby, honored at last. The lost girl, eventually found. Take whichever one you need. whatever. Stanza 4. He is a feather in the wind that never blew away. So people keep asking who he is in this stanza, and the honest answer, again, is both of them, and I refuse to choose. It's Nate, who I struck at and who I burned and who by every law of physics should have been long gone, and who is still a very, very important, one of my closest, I don't even know what to call him on this earth. 36 years later after we first met, but 32 years after I was cruel. The feather that never blew away, right? That's him. And it's Kier too, because that's how the babies we lose exist afterward, isn't it? Weightless, nearly invisible, carried on air, always somehow nearby. A feather doesn't hold on to you. It just never quite leaves the current you're standing in. Right? Now, I want to tell you where that image actually comes from too, because I didn't invent it and I never pretended I did. There's a Led Zeppelin song called Oh My Love. It's on In Through the Outdoor, 1979. Famously, the one where the usual Zeppelin machinery, the swagger, the thunder, kind of drops away into something that's almost unbearably tender. And there's a passage, and it's 4 lines near the end, that kind of circle a single image. Yours is the cloth, mine is the hand that sews time. His is the force that lies within. Ours is the fire, all the warmth we can find. He is a feather in the wind. So that's the phrase I reached for. That's the phrase I borrowed and buried in my own poem on purpose. Kind of like a coin under a floorboard, hoping someone would find it. And unbelievably, it's not even the Led Zeppelin lyrics that I have tattooed on my left arm. That's a whole different thing. Anyway, anytime I hear that song, I think of that time, but it doesn't hurt so much anymore. But why I think it belongs there, and the part that gives me chills every time, Robert Plant didn't write All My Love as a rock song or a ballad or a love song. He wrote it for his son, Carrick, who died in 1977, suddenly of a stomach infection, while Plant was on tour in America, thousands of miles away and unable to get home in time. His son was 5 years old. And some critics have called it the saddest, most heartfelt thing Led Zeppelin ever recorded, precisely because it isn't performing grief. It's a father wrecked, sending all of his love to a little boy he could no longer reach, right? It's one of only 2 Zeppelin songs Jimmy Page had no hand in writing. Even the band understood this one belonged to Plant alone. So just kind of sitting with that for a second. A father writes Feather in the Wind for a 5-year-old son. He lost him while he was away and unable to hold him. And I kind of used that as, I lost a son I did hold. And just kind of reached across all that distance and takes this exact image. No better, I don't know, no better one has ever been made. 2 parents, 2 dead little boys, 1 feather passed from his hand to mine across 50 years. And whatever, when I say I feel a soul connection to strangers who've been through this is what I mean. And it's not mystical. It's a lineage, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm rambling about at this point. I'm just going to carry on. Stanza 5, the blue. There is a touch of distant blue that finds me in the night. So blue balloons. I'm just going to say it. I talked about it a lot in season 3. I kind of explained it a little bit better, and all the incidents and, well, not all of them, but a bunch of them that I shared have happened to me over the years. I'm just going to say it plainly, and the skeptics in the audience, including the forensic psychology part of my own brain, can file their objections with the front desk. When a blue balloon shows up somewhere it has no business being, unexpected, untethered, a company name that I take my kid to for speech therapy, whatever, drifting through a parking lot, snagged in a bare tree in January, that's him. That's the deal we have. And here's where I'll put my psychology hat on for exactly 1 minute, because this matters. For most of the 20th century, grief theory said the goal was detachment. Let go, move on, sever the bond. But then in the 90s, researchers studying bereaved parents, Klaus Silverman, Nickman, they documented what grieving people had known forever. Healthy grief doesn't sever the bond. It transforms it. They called it continuing bonds. The relationship goes on. It just changes address, I guess. Signs and rituals and conversations with the dead, a balloon assigned as a messenger, dimes, feathers. People have all kinds of things, right? Smells, songs, stepping in horse shit, whatever. It's not denial. It's not pathology. It's attachment continued by other means, okay? So, no, I can't prove the balloons. I also can't prove love, and I've stopped demanding receipts from either one of them, so whatever. Stanza 6, a story that waits for the winter to break before it steps into the light. So every New Year's Eve for 3 decades, while the world celebrated New Year's Eve and the new year, I carried this privately. What grief researchers call an anniversary reaction, the body's calendar kind of keeping appointment, what the mind tries to cancel. And this was also what's called disenfranchised grief, right? Grief the world gives you no permit for. There was no funeral announcement that told the truth. There was no investigation. There was no legal recognition that a crime had taken my son from me. So many people didn't know. I did this in private, mostly. Me and Nate and his parents, my own parents didn't, they suspected, okay, I'm going to say it now, but they didn't know the full scope, the full truth of everything until 2020 when I shared everything with them. Anyway, that's when I really opened up about it. But there was if you looked at the paperwork, it was just a tragic early loss of a baby, full stop, right? Grief without acknowledgement is grief without infrastructure, right? There's no casseroles, there's no cards, there's no one saying his name. So the story waited 30 some odd winters, and this past spring, when the winter finally broke, it stepped into the light. The book, season 3, his name out loud at last, Cure. That's the poem. That's the mine shaft, lamp on all the way down. Christina wrote hers in 1991 and sat on it for so long. And I wrote mine for a boy born in 1994 and sat on the story nearly as long. And we were 2 women with 2 poems to 2 babies the world never met. And we kind of both finally published them in the same season of our lives, right? If you needed one more exhibit for the Soul Connection file, there it is. Now, Psychology Corner, you knew it was coming. Pour something. One of the most radical things I think Christina does in this book is connect her childhood to her body. Okay. So she draws a line carefully and personally, not as a doctor, but as the only person who's lived in her skin between what happened to her as a child and the illness that came for her as an adult. And a lot of readers apparently found that surprising or even controversial. And I think it should be neither, because the research has been pointing this direction for almost 30 years, I think. So let me walk you through it. And I'll be careful because this is an area where nuance saves lives, and sloppiness ruins them, okay? So I'm going to start with the ACE study, so adverse childhood experiences. Beginning in the late 90s, researchers at Kaiser and the CDC surveyed thousands of adults about 10 categories of childhood adversity. So abuse, neglect, household violence, addiction in the home, and so on. I'm not going to list them all. Then they looked at those adults' health records, and what they found kind of rearranged the field. Okay. Childhood adversity didn't just predict mental health outcomes like depression and addiction and suicide attempts. It predicted physical disease decades later in a dose-response relationship. More categories of adversity, more disease risk, heart disease, autoimmune conditions, chronic pain, earlier death. The body was keeping a ledger the whole damn time. Why? The leading framework is chronic stress physiology. A child in an unsafe home lives with a threat detection system that never gets to power down, right? Stress hormones like cortisol, which are brilliant for sprinting away from a bear, become corrosive when they're circulating year after year, right? The technical term is allostatic load. That's the cumulative wear and tear of a body that's forced to stay in survival mode. And one of the systems that takes the hit is the immune system. Chronic early life stress is associated with long-term changes in inflammation. And the immune system stuck in a low simmer, and in some people seemingly more prone to eventually turning on the body itself, right? So this brings us to MS specifically. Multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune disease. So it's the immune system attacking the protective coating on your own nerves. Okay, so nobody serious claims that trauma causes MS in any simple way. There are genetic factors. There's strong evidence about the Epstein-Barr virus. There's vitamin D. There's like a whole tangle of contributors. Okay, but in recent years, large studies have started asking the question directly: do people who experienced childhood abuse have higher rates of MS? And the answer coming back from big cohort work, including a widely cited Norwegian study following tens of thousands of women, is yes, the association is there. Childhood abuse and sexual abuse in particular was linked with meaningfully elevated MS risk later in life, even after controlling for the usual suspects like smoking and obesity. Emotional abuse and multiple categories of abuse kind of push the numbers higher still. So, sit with what that means for a second. Christina was assaulted at 5. She grew up in a violent home. She starved herself through her teens and 20s. She survived a partner she feared would kill her. And then just before she turned 50, her immune system declared war on her own nervous system. Correlation is not a verdict, and I want to be loud about that part. If you have MS or lupus or any autoimmune condition, your trauma did not doom you, and your disease is not your fault. Not your fault for having a childhood you didn't choose, not your fault for how you survived it. Plenty of people with horrific childhoods never develop autoimmune disease, and plenty of people with idyllic ones do. Risk is not destiny, but the pattern matters, because for most of medical history, the message to patients, especially women, was that the body and the biography were separate files. Your childhood goes into the therapy folder and your immune system goes into the neurology folder. Never the two shall meet. And the science keeps insisting the folders were always one. So, I don't know. I felt this in my own small way long before I could name it. I think if you listen to season 3, I had braces. 5th grade, my skin erupts. It was red, cracked, bleeding. I was like a giant scab. My face, my scalp, years of it. Dermatologists and specialists were baffled. Kids were treating me like a leper, and it turned out to be a nickel allergy. My immune system fighting a war against something bolted to my own friggin' teeth. My body was attacking itself over something that was supposed to help me. Now, that's an allergy, okay? Not trauma, and I'm not conflating them. But it was my first lesson in a truth that it took me decades to finally learn. The body responds to what's happening to it, whether or not anyone believes the body. The dermatologist said maybe stress, maybe diet, maybe just one of those things. Nobody asked what else was going on in that kid's life. Nobody asked the girl of 400 pounds either. The body keeps raising its hand and the class just keeps moving on. So when Christina connected those dots on the page, the childhood terror, the adult illness, I don't read it as a celebrity's pet theory. I read it as a patient doing what medicine is only now catching up to, reading her own chart in chronological order, I think. I don't know. Now, the part that I most want to talk about, the line in her book that made me put it down and kind of stare at the wall for a second. Christina makes the case, and I'm paraphrasing because it kind of threads through the whole book rather than sitting in one tidy sentence, that we all have a great deal to gain from going back into our own pasts and mining them for meaning. Not visiting, not glancing, mining, which is a laborious, dirty, dangerous word, but it's exactly the right one, I think. I agree with her so completely that I did it in public for an entire season of the show. So I'm going to put my psychology hat on one more time and tell you why I think we're both right. Why this isn't just memoir writers justifying their genre, okay? So first, there's expressive writing. James Pennebaker's research, going back into the 80s, keeps finding the same strange result. People who write about their most difficult experiences in depth, connecting facts to feelings, they show measurable improvements. Fewer doctor's visits, better immune markers in some studies, improved mood over time. Not because writing is magic, but because of what writing kind of forces you to do. You're turning this shapeless, wordless horror into a sequence, right? So trauma is stored badly, okay? It's fragmented, it's sensory, it's timeless, which is why survivors can tell you the color of a shirt, but not the day of the week. Language imposes order, beginning, middle, end. And a story with an end is a story your nervous system can finally file as over, right? Second, there's narrative identity. So Dan McAdams and others have spent decades studying the stories people tell about their own lives, and one pattern keeps predicting well-being, what researchers call redemptive sequences. Not pretending the bad thing was good, but constructing a narrative in which the bad thing led somewhere, right? People who can tell that kind of story about their suffering consistently score higher on measures of purpose and generativity, the drive to contribute something to the people coming after you. Which is, not coincidentally, exactly what both of these books are. Christina says outright the book isn't self-help, and it isn't even really inspirational. It's just her thoughts for the kids who came from abuse and are trying to navigate what comes after. That's generativity in its purest form, I think, right? Mine the past, not because the past deserves your attention, but because somebody younger is currently lost in the same stupid cave and you're the only one holding a map, right? Third is post-traumatic growth. So Tedeschi and Calhoun's work, the finding that a substantial number of trauma survivors report, alongside all the damage, genuine positive change, deeper relationships, clearer priorities, a sense of personal strength, and even a changed philosophy of life. And here's the part, like everyone kind of skips over. Post-traumatic growth doesn't come from the trauma. Trauma teaches jack shit, okay? Trauma just breaks things. The growth comes from the processing. So it's the deliberate, effortful, meaning-making afterward, right? The mining, the trauma is like the earthquake, and the growth is the rebuilding. And rebuilding only happens if you're willing to walk back into the rubble with a clipboard. And there's a crucial distinction here, because I can already hear someone saying, Beth, my therapist told me not to ruminate, and now you're telling me to move into my past with a pickaxe? So rumination and meaning making are opposites wearing the same coat, I guess. Rumination is the loop, right? The same scene, the same questions. Why me? What if? No exit. Meaning making is the loop with a friggin' shovel. You go through the scene, but each pass you're extracting something, a pattern, a name for what happened, a sentence you can hand to somebody else. Rumination circles the wound. Mining goes through it and comes out the other side carrying ore. Okay. I know the difference because I've done both. I spent maybe 94 through 2013 ruminating, the voice in my head running Brandon's script long after Brandon was gone, torturing myself with a precision he could only have dreamed of. And then eventually I spent years mining, right? Therapy, study, writing, finally the book. Same past, same material, completely different relationship to it. The past didn't change one atom. I changed what I was doing in there, okay? So Christina says writing hers wasn't cathartic, and I believe her. And I tell you the same about mine. Cathartic, like I said, suggests that you pour the pain out, and the container is now empty. It never empties, okay? What changes is who's carrying it and how. So before the mining, the past carries you. It decides your reactions and your relationships and your body. But after the mining, you carry it. It's still really friggin' heavy, but it's luggage now, right? It's not a kidnapper. And I argue, too, that the payoff isn't only personal. Every mind story changes the map for everyone. So before Christina's book, the official story of Kelly Bundy was lucky blonde girl, iconic role, charmed Hollywood life. Millions of struggling teenage girls compared themselves to that fiction. I would know. I was compared to it. Now the record shows a starving, terrified, abused kid performing carelessness for a laughing nation. That correction matters, I think. Every time a survivor mines their past and publishes the ore, the general human map of what a fine-looking life can actually contain gets more accurate. And accurate maps save the people still walking. Does it make sense? We're almost done here. Okay. The other side. Let me land this plane. Okay. There is a moment near the end of my own book where I write about the difference between being silenced and choosing silence. How I spent my whole life having quiet imposed on me, and how it took the world literally shutting down for me to discover what chosen quiet felt like. Peace. It turned out, the space to grieve without an audience, the stillness in which for the first time I could hear my own voice instead of everyone's instructions for it, right? Christina had her own version of forced stillness. Hers wasn't a lockdown. Hers was a bed. MS took the stages and the sets and the dancing and shrank her world down to a damn mattress. And in that stillness, surrounded by memories she'd probably rather forget and journals marked for burning, she made the same choice I did. Not to let the quiet be a tomb, but to make it a mine. So we're two women, never met, one raised in Laurel Canyon among rock stars, one raised in Ontario among church folk, right? One silenced by an industry that only wanted the pretty parts, and one silenced by a culture that called it being respectful. Both of us were compared to Kelly Bundy, one professionally, me at a gas station, both keeping the real story in a fireproof container. Hers was cardboard, mine was my bones, right? And both in the end deciding the story comes out because somebody out there is surviving silently right now the way we did. And that person doesn't need us to be inspiring. They need us to be honest. They need to feel, say it with me, Christina, less alone. So yes, read You with the Sad Eyes. Read it if you loved her. Read it if you only knew the hair and the smirk. Read it especially if you have your own fire retardant box, literal or otherwise. It's brutal and it's genuinely funny, sometimes in the same paragraph, which is the only ratio trauma survivors trust anyway, right? And when you get to the parts that feel impossible to believe them. That gap between what people saw and what she survived, it's real. I've lived in that gap, and I think half of you listening have as well. Dad, if you can hear me wherever you are, you were more right than you knew. You're just wrong about which one of them I was. I wasn't the character. Neither, it turns out, was she. If a blue balloon drifts past you this week somewhere it has no earthly business being, say hi for me. Guard your quiet, everybody, and when you're ready, use it. Before I let you go, the usual housekeeping, and then something that matters to me. If you'd like to support the production costs of this show, join the Facebook group, reach out to me for any reason at all. Everything you need is in the show notes. And this episode specifically, any proceeds that it brings in, whether that's a direct donation to me or any ads that might run on it, which for the record, I have zero control over and could not even name for you if you held my feet to the fire. A portion is going to MS Canada for this episode because you don't really sit with a book like this and a diagnosis like Christina's and then just move on with your afternoon, right? And this actually brings me to Susie. Susie is my half-brother's wife. And if you're trying to draw that family tree, don't, just trust me. Susie is a sparkly, glittery unicorn of a human being, relentlessly, almost suspiciously positive. And she is living with MS right now, which means every bit of what we talked about today, the pain, the unpredictability, the body declaring war on itself, she's navigating in real time. And she's doing it with more glitter than most people bring to a good day. She is an absolute warrior. Susie, this one's for you. Keep sparkling, my love. We're all behind you. I'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Unbound Off Script. We know these aren't always easy places to go, and we appreciate you being here with Beth Curry as she stumbles through the things that matter most. If you have something on your heart that you'd like her to speak to, we're here. Contact info is in the show notes. Until next time, be good to yourself and others.